Welcome to Slam the Gavel, the show that tells it all regarding family court, other court issues, as well as CPS. I'm your host, Maryann Petri. There is a family rights rally, the Children's Movement, that will take place May 21st, 2022, at the Washington Monument, Washington, D.C., Northeast Quadrant, at 1 p.m. through 6 p.m. The sponsor is Family Forward Project. This is to unify and provide information and networking opportunities for family dealing with CPS. And the mission is to unify all platforms across the nation to make one major statement and demand for reform. So please be there if you can. Right now, I have a brand new guest. His name is Bill Dubree. He is a Ph.D. He has spent a 50-year career working in experimental psychology with special focus on learning theory applications to behavior. Bill's work in quality of life resulted in an expansion of the understandings in learning theory, especially the constructions of theoretical evolutionary models that explain the roots of the unaffected motivational drive system in human behavior. His career concentrated on large-scale planning of quality of life projects and extensive research. As an experimental psychologist, Bill specialized in the observation and measurement of behavior. Learning theory spawned behavior solutions that worked in addressing even pathological behavior such as parental child abuse. Over the last 4 years, Bill shifted his work to address the global epidemic of families destroyed by abusive parents, where the influence of the family courts has become an enabler. Using his experimental background, he has crafted solutions to the victims of parental alienation through the lens of directive behavioral strategies, which recognize the pathology quickly and implement procedures that are both intuitively reasoned and we now know are effective modifiers that remove the victims from the experience field that caused and maintained the aberrant alienation influenced behaviors. I completely welcome you to the show, Dr. Dubree. How are you today?
Very good. Thank you. It's nice to be here.
I'm glad to have you on. How did you get involved in all of this?
4 years ago, I became aware of an epidemic that seemed to be all over the world. And the epidemic was a change in human behavior that had resulted in a rise of parents who would abuse children in such a way that rendered the children incapable or afraid to interact with their other parent. So as I began to investigate this problem, it became apparent that over the last 40 years, the court system, which seems to direct most of the action, becomes cemented into a methodology that just doesn't work. Children were not being rescued, and the system was totally dependent on delegation methods that created unaffordable billings for people literally all over the world.
Mm-hmm. That I have to agree with.
So I decided to spend a full year investigating this problem and started working in New Zealand, then Australia, throughout Europe, had interactions with the European Court of Human Rights, then of course North America, Canada, United States mostly, and began to see a pattern emerge that was really startling. In fact, there seemed to be a uniform conformity from one court to another independent of the country. And that is something that no one would expect. You would think that courts would make decisions that were more idiosyncratic. In other words, matching the issues of the presenting parents with a solution that would work. But in no case did I find that. And so it's been become a disaster that has bankrupted families, and it continues to be a disaster to this day. really, when you look at the family courts, and I guess most of what I'm going to talk about today is really going to revolve around the issue specifically of this epidemic of parents who have children who have rejected them, and the court's behavior in such a situation and how they behave and what the solution is. And if we have time, I'll even go into the etiology of what I have constructed as the cause of parents who abuse children. When you look at the family courts, it's a stunning display of behavioral stupidity and ignorance. The operation of families is about behavior, not legal constructs and jargon. Courts don't understand this. Mm-hmm. It's almost like it's the wrong tool. The system resembles an open-air prison, mostly, where decisions on family dynamics, such as custody or child support decisions, it either locks people in or out of exercising what really for 5 million years is an evolutionary understanding of what we've always thought of as natural rights. But its decisions are rendered as biased preferences for the most part, since no lawyer or judge, in my experience in 4 years, either possesses behavioral knowledge, and they avoid accountability by delegating away such concerns to people specialized in mental health. Family courts behave like an imperious nobility, expecting unquestioned obedience and reverence. The subject of mental health is one that I'd like to spend a few minutes to talk about because, for the most part, the courts defer all of their decisions and their orders to be resolved by mental health professionals. And what do we mean by that? In family courts, mental health people represent the therapist, reunification therapist, the guardians, oftentimes guardians are mental health people, and certainly the evaluators, and this new class of people called parental coordinators, oftentimes have mental health backgrounds. It's astonishing to come face to face with today's courts referred mental health practitioners, whose opinions reflect more often stupidity as a virtue. Mm-hmm. Faced with an urgent task where suspicions give rise to child abuse, mental health workers seem chained to a dogmatic principle or principles of training in what are non-directive and client-centered talk therapies. A common sense question that most any person on the street could competently answer is, if a child were suspected of being abused, would it be best to remove the child from the circumstance where the circumstances correlated with the abuse, or enable the abuse by allowing the child to continue to live in close proximity to the suspected cause? And this is an interesting question, because the courts, whenever they're confronted with a suspicion of a child behaving in a way that's not expected towards another parent, and this could be in the court as testimony, could be in a variety of circumstances, but when they have that suspicion, the way they deal with that suspicion is immediately defer that child to a therapist and order the child to the primary care of the abusing parent, which is totally counterintuitive to anything anybody could possibly imagine. The therapeutic talk process refuses to confront the child. This is the big problem. Therapy is the antithesis of the way you need to deal with a child who was involved or suspected of experiencing child abuse. By refusing to confront the child and mindful of suspicions of child manipulation, mental health exacerbates and perpetuates the conditions that maintain the strength of the maladaptive symptoms of the child, that defy natural expected behaviors described and displayed as positive attachment. In other words, what we mean by maladaptive behaviors, when a child refuses contact with a parent, there can be a variety of behaviors that can be described as maladaptive, and that may be under categories such as avoidance, defiance, communication refusal, self-care issues such as not attending to their space. So there's a variety of things that can be observed. And one of the things about learning theory, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, which is really a solution pathway, an alternative to mental health, is that observation is truthful. It's not something that's listened to and there's no opinions about it. And when you can observe an event, you can also describe it and you can measure it, and it gives you the powers of prediction, which therapy can't do. So that's what I mean by maladaptive symptoms. When a child who's been involved in being trained to be abusive to a parent, in other words, to torment a parent or to reject a parent, the symptoms, the display of behaviors that you would see in that child reflect what I call maladaptive behaviors. Imagine, if you will, that you stumbled on a house on fire. And from that house were the cries of a child. What would you do? Well, if you're a therapist, there's one pathway, and if you're someone else, there's another pathway. What a therapist typically does is they look at a situation like this as an irrational fear the child's experiencing. And they will walk into the house on fire and sit down and talk to the child, not confront the child, in a way that they ultimately expect to be able to help the child cope with that irrational fear. What would the common person on the street do? What do you think? Well, guy on the street has actually more common sense than you think. And in this situation would run into the house, would immediately pick up the child and run out of the house. And what that does is that person just is become a way of protecting that child and giving that child a sense of security. And by removing the child from the house also creates the circumstance where the child is now in a different experience, one from a very dangerous, fearful experience to an experience that's, for the child, creates the circumstance that the child has to learn to adapt to different circumstances. And that's a clue to part of the solution pathway that I use when I'm working with kids who have been abused. We'll get into that later. Non-directive, client-centered therapy and counseling is not the correct tool for any what we call parental alienation pathology. I don't normally use the word parental alienation, but it's definitely not the right tool when you have a child who's been abused. It's dangerously reckless because it wastes time. When the child is being abused, why would you want to leave a child in a place where that gives the parent more time to engage with the child and training that child in maladaptive behaviors to refuse another parent? It makes no sense at all. It fails to protect the child. It relies on opinions, not clear scientific techniques, and objective honesty, especially true of evaluators. It causes frequent clinical enmeshments, allied with the child's maladaptive delusions. It relies on subjective verbal content of the client. It is not equipped to investigate or employ methods of strategic observation. It just doesn't do that. And there's no real behavioral or clinical analysis or assessment, thus no rudder really to navigate. So just to reiterate, the difference between therapy and the solution pathways, that therapy is a talk methodology and to engage a child to ultimately help that child deal with or cope with the pathology of whatever the fear is. The learning theory approach, which we'll talk about, is based on strategic observation, which is honest, real, transparent. Anybody can see it. It can be peer reviewed. And it's a totally different, polar opposite, should say, approach to a therapeutic approach. And it works quickly to identify and describe the behavioral pathologies and to remove the child as quickly as possible from the source, or whatever is correlated with the maladaptive behaviors. So there's a better way, and we're going to talk about that. But before we do, let's just talk about the court system for a few minutes more, because I want to really drive home this point that I have come up, and maybe alone, but I think a lot of parents would agree with me, because one of the things I do is I talk to parents every day, and just in the last month, I think I've talked to over 100 parents who are going through this problem worldwide. Mm-hmm. So I have a lot of experience talking to them and their experiences in courts, and I believe it's not unfair to say or to suggest that the court system is a conspiracy. Mm-hmm. Think about that. Mm-hmm. In their reckless decisions, both the court and the court-referred mental health therapists fail to protect the child, and by their actions deliberately enable abuse. In other words, the court system itself is the cause of the abuse, because by allowing the child to stay with a parent, the primary custodian, where there's a suspicion that the behavior is somehow developed or enabled in that space, it's what they're doing is perpetuating the problem, not solving it. It is not an exaggeration, then, to suggest that family court behaves as an incompetent system. They don't have any skills in behavior at all. Mm-mm. It's designed to deliberately enable and maintain criminally lunatic state of endless abuse. Parents respecting the nobility of the family courts, and that's how we're all trained from childhood, engage in false beliefs in a system that encourages them to abdicate of all things their natural rights. Just walk away from them. The minute you walk through the door of the court, you have given up your rights. You've abdicated your rights to a stranger. Mm-hmm. How stupid is that?
I know it.
Parents, when a damaged family relinquishes its destiny to the family court, what is not yet damaged in the family is, I guess we'll use a term you'll like, is by the slam of the gavel, thoroughly destroyed by the lunatic decisions of clueless and insouciant people connected to the court. Mm-hmm. So the worst decision you may make in your life is when you have a family conflict is to delegate it to the court. Because once you go through that door, the court assumes power over the situation and assumes guardianship rights over the child in such a way that the court delegates the entire circus. And there's no way out.
No.
It becomes a treadmill. And you're on it for years.
And people get sucked into it very quickly.
It's a despicable system, absolutely. And it does not fit the circumstances of child abuse at all. It does not know how to deal with it. Mm-hmm. So It's the equivalent of giving matches to a pyromaniac and setting a forest fire.
Hmm.
That's what the court is. Whatever the problem is, they make it 1,000 times worse. So is it chaos, lunacy, incompetence, or greed that drives the family law syndicate?
It's all of it.
What started as a family conflict driven by an unhinged, alienating parent evolves into an extreme world of dark confusion, devoid of any reason or common sense. An arrogant, uninformed, incompetent, and willfully ignorant army of experts inflates the family's conflicts with extreme and stressful complexity.
Hmm.
They are the dismal heart of the family law syndicate, the mental health group, which are all billing the client, wrecking their financial circumstances, along with the attorneys. And so basically what happens is the court assumes to delegate all power.
Hmm.
It overrides any humanitarian concerns. It suffocates any meaningful efforts to mitigate success. It threatens draconian criminal consequences for mere disobedience. It expects unopposed compliance to its orders. Resistance becomes futile.
Hmm.
It sucks out all power, energy, and momentum from the victims. It is a reckless ride to perdition. And target parents learn they are condemned to behave with the cry of the voice unheard, literally.
Hmm.
Where's it all going to end? It's a nightmare.
Yeah. Of magnitude proportions.
Unimaginable proportions.
Hmm.
And if you think I'm kidding, you should spend a day with me talking to these parents
Hmm.
and their experiences with the family courts and the mental health people.
Mm.
I have not heard a single person tell me that a mental health individual has ever helped them rescue their child, not once. In
Exactly.
4 years.
Hmm.
And reunification, oh, it's no such thing. I don't know where it's trained. I don't know a single university in the world that trains a discipline called reunification therapy. I don't know where that came from.
Mm.
It's totally made up. It's a rudderless group of people that have no idea what they're going to do when they engage a child in talk therapy. But what does happen is the child, whatever is controlling the child's maladaptive behaviors, is the office of the therapist becomes an extension of the experience field that controls those behaviors. And in no way does that help the child. It only makes the child much worse.
Hmm.
So we'll start to move a little bit into maybe discussing some of the solution pathway.
Okay.
First of all, behavior is it's a function of learning. And strategic learning is conditioned learning. In other words, what happens to a child when a child is abused, and that abuse is strategic. What we mean by that, there's an agenda, and the agenda is a parent who has some need to be able to cause that child to inflict pain on another individual. That process is a learning process. all behavior is a function of cause and effect. And so even though we don't see the abuse, we can't see the cause, which is the fallacy of the courts, because that's what they're looking for. The smoking gun, they'll never find it. That's why nothing ever happens with these therapists.
Mhm.
They can't find this. The abuse always happens in the dark. In other words, children are abused in situations where there's no one who corroborates it, and even the child frequently won't do that. So the child's being trained, and of course, learning. If you're doing deliberate, agenda-driven training, that results in the child learning behaviors that are displayed in a specific pattern, such as what we describe as maladaptive behaviors, the avoidance and disrespect and contact refusal and all that sort of thing. And so it's a learning situation that we're looking at. The cause is training the child deliberately. And the child is either instructed and since the child's with that parent all the time, most likely what's happening also is, you can assume, role modeling the behavior of the abusive parent. So all we know and all we can see is what we can observe in the child's behavior and that we can describe. That's honest. But trying to assume, which just about everybody I talk to who's got an attorney is trying to find some mud to sling on the abusing parent in the hopes that the court will buy into it, and they will allege that the parent is abusing the child, but it just rarely, if ever, happens. Mm-hmm. It's a waste of time, actually, to go that direction. So the behavioral approach, what we do when I work with parents to try to overcome this problem, it's a process of presenting the parent with training, a training scenario where that training is going to result in some change in the parent's behavior that's going to affect how that parent is going to be able to interact with the court. Mm-hmm. So it's a vastly different approach. No parent is going to get their child back without some work and effort. You can't just delegate to an attorney and hand them a pile of papers and expect anything to happen. It's not going to. It's not going to. There is no evidence that this problem is going away. It just consistently goes on and on and on for years and years and years till children age out at 18. Mm-hmm. The behavioral approach, which is a learning approach, uses a strategic reinforcement procedure to ensure a rapid reshaping and restoring the original behavior of the child. In other words, that child, the memory of that parent and that child together when things were good. That's what that would be the objective here. Mm-hmm. And of course, the learning behavioral approach is far less costly than the approach with the attorneys and the reunification therapists, and or even these retreats around the country that are run by a number of psychologists that bring kids in for a couple of days and restores their personality. They work, incidentally. There's no question that they don't work. They do, but not for the reasons that they believe. There is a reason why they work, but we may not have time to get into that today. So the learning approach has been modeled in what is called a procedure, especially designed for moderate and severe cases of what is alienation child abuse, where contact with the victim child is at risk. The procedure is called, what I call it, is alienation contingency step program. It's a 6-step program that's a piece of paper that's handed to the court, which becomes, once we're in the court, becomes the court order. The court, when they order the change in strategy, we are the ones that have handed it to the court. So there's no question about it. And mental health therapists don't do that. They don't give the court a piece of paper and say these are the steps we have to go through to get this father and this
Mhm.
child, or this mother and this child back together again.
Mhm.
So in that sense, it's a paradigm shift completely in the way the court has learned to behave, and accepting a strategy from someone outside of the court system and is not on their referral system, and walks in and hands them a piece of paper and says, this is not a complex problem. These are the steps, and then explain those steps to the court and give them the theoretical understanding of what learning theory is, so that they understand how the behavior occurs and why we're not looking for the cause, because there's no relevance in looking for the cause. Let's assume the child has cancer. You get a call and someone says, and the parent who's been abusing the child, instead of abuse, it's cancer. Would you really care what caused the cancer? Do you want to take the child as quickly as possible to the hospital to get him fixed?
Mhm.
All right. Well,
Mhm.
we're only going to look at the cancer. We're
Mhm.
not looking at the cause. The cause doesn't matter. So let's suppose the child has maladaptive behaviors. Same thing. We're not going to ask what caused the behaviors. We know that there's a correlation between where the behaviors were learned, because all behavior is learned in context. People don't, it's very simple stuff to understand. And we call that context an experience field. And the experience field and the context has boundaries, and everything within those boundaries in learning theory become familiar to the child. The child sees these objects, the street lights, the streets, the colors, the cars, the schools, all the buildings in the area, and everything by virtue of that child exploring that neighborhood becomes familiar. And that familiarity is what comes to control the maladaptive symptoms of the child. In other words, maintains those behaviors and strengthens them, and as well as the adaptive behaviors of the child. So we know that wherever the behavior is learned, obviously what I said a few minutes ago, what do you want to do? You want to get the child out of the fire. If the neighborhood and the experience field is correlated with the time that the child has spent where the child expresses these maladaptive behaviors, the first thing you want to do is move the child
Mhm.
out of that maladaptive experience field and put the child somewhere where you can have a reasonable opportunity to extinguish those maladaptive symptoms. And that's what you want to do. You want to cure the cancer, or you want to cure the maladaptive behaviors.
Mhm. Mhm.
Same thing. This is common sense. I mean, any judge or any person on the street can understand what I'm saying. This is not hard to understand.
Mhm.
But we're not trained as a society to think in these terms. So it's time to break the mold, don't you think?
Mhm. Most definitely.
So the learning approach is simple, it's honest, it's common sense, it's rapid, and it's affordable.
Mhm.
A lot of people don't realize this. I mean, they're very surprised. So what is learning theory? It's an explanatory system of all behavior.
Mhm.
It's the foundation of psychology. A lot of people don't realize that. Going back to William James and Pavlov and J.B. Watson, the people I was around when I was a young man 50 years ago, Skinner and Joe Wolpe and Harry Harlow and a whole bunch of people that I knew. That's where psychology came from. The therapy came more out of the Sigmund Freud variety of thinking. So it's validated. The claims of learning theory are not only validated, all we did is take what all animals do, all primates do, and we just simply organized that knowledge through observation into a body of understanding and rationales and explanations. And from that, we were able to evolve solutions, which we call either operant or classical conditioning, of the two processes, for the most part, that learning theory employs to be able to change behavior. The focus is on the child. Remember, we don't care about the conflict.
Mhm.
Learning theorists do not care about the cause. We only care about when we're presented with behavior, the question becomes, are we supposed to change behavior or not? When you think about the behavior, how do we establish that the behavior needs to be changed? Well, all behaviors occur on what we call an adaptation continuum. What I mean by that is on one side of the continuum are behaviors that could be described as being productive. And on the other end of the continuum are behaviors that are described as being unproductive. And those behaviors are what I'm talking about as being maladaptive. So for a child to express contact refusal,
Mhm.
avoidance, disrespect, all these sorts of things to a parent, what does that imply? Well, it implies the child doesn't have the capacity for empathy or compassion. It implies the child may not have the social skills to be able to express regrets or gratitude. So it's a dangerous situation to allow that to continue.
Mm.
So the objective for a learning theorist is very simple. We see the behavior, we know where it is on the adaptation schedule, and our task then is already pre-designed for us, and that is to change the behavior.
Mhm.
This isn't hard to understand, but it certainly is when you get it into the complex soup of therapists that
Mhm.
takes on a life of its own.
Mhm.
There's never any answers. There's no clarity. It's a dark hallway. Whereas learning theory is in the open, in the sunlight, transparent. Anybody can understand it. It appeals to common sense. And it's a strategy that the courts now, I've had great success getting the courts to embrace it. As far away as the European Court of Human Rights, I've had success.
Mhm.
In England, Ireland, which is a very tough court system because they don't have a family court. One judge hears everything.
Mhm.
Canada, Alberta, and British Columbia specifically.
Mhm.
And of course, the United States. My most recent case was in Indianapolis. Judge ordered after I described what I'm describing to you, a change in the process, took the paper that we handed to the court and endorsed it as the court's order.
Hmm.
That's the way they solve the problem.
Mhm.
So
Let me
the
ask.
yeah,
Oh, I was
go
going to
ahead.
ask, what do you do with these? A parent that is a personality disorder that obstructs, you know, um, say what you're trying to do, and then they've got a psychologist that's going along with them. It's a big mess. I mean, I don't know. I just don't
Well,
know.
I typically don't pay much attention to the abusing parent, except at the point within the framework of what the court wants to do. And what I would like to do is restore a family dynamic. Our approach is very compassionate.
Mhm.
And it looks at I tend to look at the parent who's abusing as a person who's in great pain, because what other person could possibly inflict such torture and torment on a child to refuse contact and to torment another parent? So that parent, um, just to use a layman's term, needs fixing.
Mhm.
Uh, Behavioral approaches are very good at working with parents who have their own maladaptive behaviors. And so we will suggest to the court that there be an attempt to work with the abusing parent in order to extinguish those behaviors that are a risk to the child so that we can restore a family dynamic, hopefully co-parenting.
Mhm.
That's the ultimate goal. That's what I think it's important for everybody to understand. We're not there as advocates for either parent. We're there as advocates for a child. When learning theory advocates for the person who has the maladaptive symptoms,
Mhm.
not the parents. So, and I agree with you that the abusing a parent often gets support from the therapeutic community. That's very right. That happens all the time. The evaluators who basically, whoa, let's just think about this for a minute. And this is something most people don't think about. When you're in a courtroom and one parent is an abusing parent and the other parent is a loving parent, which parent do you think expresses sadness and distress? Which parent do you expresses confidence and seems totally together and aligned with their purpose? Well, the parent who's lost a child is the one who expresses the appropriate emotion.
Mhm.
The court looks at that as weakness,
Mhm.
oftentimes ordering evaluation in order to sort out what the court seems to falsely believe is a bad parent, a parent who's, for some reason, this child behaves this way because this parent, look at this parent can't hold themselves together in the court. Well, it's a cool, calm, collected parent who I know clinicians like to talk about as sociopaths.
Mhm.
They're much better in court in performing than the parent who has a legitimate emotional concern for their child. They look different and they behave differently. So the courts, in fact, don't have the perspicacity or the sensitivity to be able to see and understand a parent who is who's suffering, and that suffering, which we often call trauma, is really that parent is crying out for their child, and that would be what you would expect of a healthy parent. On the other hand, a parent who's abusing a child
Mhm.
does not have that level of emotional attachment, and you can see that in the courtroom. You can see it in their behavior.
Mhm.
Matter of fact, if anybody describes them, and I have gotten close enough to them through communications that I've been able to assess basically what and describe their behaviors, and they are much colder. They don't have these warm emotions for their child. Because the child really, in a meaningful way, becomes treated as property by the abusing parent.
Mhm.
It's a tool. And so when you understand those differences, and of course, learning theory looks at it, because we're trained in strategic observation and not just to listen to people, you can see this behavior,
Mhm.
you can measure it, you can even predict it. So it's a very powerful way, change in the strategy of going into a courtroom. And we feel that the only solution right now is to get the courts to recognize there has to be a paradigm shift in the way in which the courts handle specifically cases of child abuse,
Mhm.
where a child is, when the suspicion comes to the court, instead of delegating to mental health people to use this strategy, which I've just detailed, which is where the parent is called upon, the one with the most experience with the child, the emotional experience and history with the child, is the one who's trained to recover their child. So what we do is we train the trainer.
Mhm.
We train the child. We don't train the child, we train the parent of the child to recover their own child. We don't send them to a retreat.
Mhm.
So as a consequence, the enormous cost of these programs around the country that are, and I won't mention the names of the people who run them, but most people know who I'm talking about. They're very effective, but the reason why they're effective is because when you remove a child from a fire to a brook and a field, you're going to see a change in behavior.
Mhm.
Child's no longer, the threat is gone. So when you take the threat away, it does change behavior. So when you move a child from an experience field where the child is operating with the abusing parent to a location where you have what we would call a novel experience field, where the child is confronted with a moment of what we call awkwardness We all go through. Everybody feels that when we go to a new hotel room somewhere,
Mhm.
or a vacation, or a cruise ship, or take a drive in the country someplace you haven't been before. The term is awkwardness, and awkwardness forces people in a learning way of thinking into adapting. And that adaptation process is where we have the power to extinguish the maladaptive symptoms and recover the child's behavior.
Mm.
This is not hard stuff to understand. And the person most effective in doing this, once they're trained and understand something about the specific reinforcement procedures and tools that can be used out of the toolbox we have in learning theory, we train them in that, specific to the needs of that specific child, understanding some of the reinforcement background of the child. The child's behavior changes. It's just that simple. It's not that this is not hard. So it's a very different approach.
Mhm.
It's a compassionate approach. It's an affordable approach. It's one that doesn't require an attorney. Attorneys are good for procedure, but they don't understand behavior.
Mhm.
And the few attorneys that I have worked with seem to like this process. So once they understand it, they like it. The only thing that concerns me is that the therapists probably don't like it, would probably call me reckless, because it really, what I am is not a threat to the child. I'm a threat to their income.
Mhm.
And that seems to be something that drives the court system. The syndicate is money. I don't
Mhm.
know any other explanation for it, because everything they do is counterintuitive and rises to the
Exactly.
level of stupidity. And as I say, the whole system behaves as though stupidity were a virtue.
Mhm. Yeah.
Now, if people would like to learn more about what I do, and we're a small organization growing, um, one by one, we're acquiring people with behavioral backgrounds who can do the same thing I've just discussed. And anybody who's a behaviorist could do what I'm doing. This is nothing. You can everything I've said you can look up in a book somewhere, a graduate school textbook probably. Um, but you can reach us for an appointment. You can schedule your own appointment. And I'll just quickly give you, if anybody gets their pencil and paper together, I'll give you the address to go to online, which will send you to a scheduling appointment calendar. It's www.hopeindarkness, all small letters, hope in darkness, HOPEINDARKNESS dot me, M-E, / appointment dot HTM, APPOINTMENT dot HTM. So if you go on that link, you'll be able to access a scheduling calendar, and you can schedule an appointment, and we'll have a discussion. We'll get a team together, and they'll come and talk to you about your specific issues. And if learning theory is an application, it can work to help solve your problem.
Mhm. Um, Excellent. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah. I totally agree with everything you said about the courts.
They are despicable,
Yes.
unfortunately.
Mhm. Oh, they're hurting so many generations to come down the pike than they care to know about.
The courts are directly enabling child abuse. And when the judge understands his accountability or her accountability for this child abuse, it will cause them to want to make a change in the strategy. And to date, nobody has done that. So what we do is we put the court on trial.
Mhm.
We don't put the we're not interested in the parents. Doesn't matter. We're only interested in rescuing this child and helping to fix these maladaptive behaviors.
Mhm.
Yeah. So when the court realizes their accountability for these behaviors, like any person, they are inspired to think that they may not want to continue that behavior because they're given a choice.
Mm.
Here's the piece of paper, the solution pathway to ending this despicable behavior.
Right.
Or, Your Honor, you can go ahead and order the same thing over and over again and expect different results. All you're
Mhm.
going to wind up doing is hurting this child. So that's our message to the court.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much. I'd like to see you come back on as a guest if you like.
Sure, I would love to do that.
Oh,
Thank you very much.
oh, great. Well, hey, don't jump off. Slam the Gavel is a podcast to help the public understand what really goes on in these family courtrooms that in turn perpetuate parental alienation. I'm your host, Maryann Petri, author of Dismantling Family Court Corruption, Why Taking the Kids Was Not Enough, and Cry Out for Justice, Poems of Truth. Please join us again here with Dr. Dubree in the future and other exciting guests. Thank you so much, Dr. Dubree.
You're quite welcome. I look forward to seeing you again.
Definitely.